Good evening, everybody. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 28 and 29 tonight, if you would open your Bibles there. Questions are on the back if you need them. This is the last set of questions for the quarter, so be sure to pick those up, and we'll cover the remainder of 1 Samuel on Sunday to finish out this quarter. So chapter 28 and 29 tonight. Just to recap real quick, consistent with the last several weeks, we're still dealing with this turmoil with David and Saul, and David being on the run from Saul, how he's been ostracized from court. He's been separated out from the nation of Israel, really. We saw him kind of get to share a lot of his feelings on that in the last class, where he's talking to Saul and talking about all the difficulties of him being kind of on the run here, beyond just the fact that someone's trying to kill him, but the fact that he's unable to worship as he would normally like to be able to worship. There's a lot of difficulties with him and all these people that he is now leading being on the run, and we saw in chapter 27 where David and his group of 600 go and stay in Ziklag amongst the Philistines, right? So he goes and stays there, and Achish gives him an area for him and all the inhabitants that are from Israel get to stay in Ziklag while they're living among the Philistines. And we saw how David is kind of covertly accomplishing God's will, striking down these wicked people while kind of under the guise of pretending to do it for the Philistines and pretending that he's doing it against the nation of Israel, when he's really been destroying the Jeruelites or the Jeshurelites and some other groups of people that would have kind of been common enemies with Israel and with the Philistines. But it allows David to kind of go under the radar. So that's where we left off in chapter 27. And so let's pick up in chapter 28, break up the lesson that way, and then discuss some of chapter 28, get into chapter 29 before class is over. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into chapter 28. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that you've provided to us. We thank you for the blessings that we have here at Brownsburg. We pray that you continue to watch over us and help us as we strive to learn more about you and study your word. Please be with all the classes this evening, Father, and bless all the students and teachers, and that much growth will be done here as we continue to learn more about you and to grow closer to the example of Christ. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, chapter 28, let's go ahead and read that through here. 1 Samuel 28. It said, "In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'Understand that you and your men are to go out to war with me in the army.' David said to Achish, 'Very well. You shall know what your servant can do.' And Achish said to David, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.' Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shinnim. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, 'Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servants said to him, 'Behold, there is a medium of Endor.' So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, 'Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you.' The woman said to him, 'Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?' But Saul swore to her by the Lord, 'As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing.' Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' He said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And he said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. And she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they arose and went away that night. All right, that's chapter 28. So we have this experience here with Saul and this medium that he goes to see. But just to start out here, what new scenario is addressed at the start of chapter 28? Before we get to Saul and his pursuit of a medium, what's the scenario that's laid out for us? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. All right, so as has been a common theme, we're about to see another battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. And so now we see that starting, if you look back at the start of chapter 28 in verse 4, it kind of seems here that the Philistines are kind of assembling to make some large attack. Now we've seen there's been back and forth battles and things like that off and on, these people these nations that are in close proximity, often in conflict. But here we see a very, concerted effort by the Philistines to bring about a great force to attack the Israelites. Now, what does it say happens in the immediate aftermath of the of the Philistines gathering their masses and assembling at Shumam? What is the first thing that we are told? Okay, why is that significant? Before we even know anything else, why is that one of those key words that should set us off? Okay, so that's going to have to do with why Saul goes to, the medium as he does. But what previous experience do we have with the phrase, Saul was greatly afraid, or his heart trembled? When have we seen that happen before? What other times has this happened? Happened with Goliath, right? That one, the whole army as well. And even here, I think we kind of get that same imagery. But with Goliath, chapter 17, where else did we see Saul greatly afraid. I'm thinking of two other situations in particular. All right, with the Amalekites, and then what was the other time? Well, not so much when David could have killed him, but there were two interactions, right? There was the one where he didn't respond, and I'm kind of spacing it now, and I probably should the chapter that it was in. But we often remember when he offers the sacrifices earlier than, because he's waiting for Samuel, but he goes ahead and offers sacrifices before Samuel gets there. And then also, he doesn't wipe out the Amalekites, right? He keeps them. So those are two situations, but in each of those situations, as well as with Goliath, where he falls short of his kingly responsibility because he should have gone out there, each of those situations it said he was afraid. Even Saul verbalizes that. The author of 1 Samuel tells us in chapter 17, Saul's afraid with Goliath. But the other two situations, Saul himself verbalizes like, all right, why did you offer sacrifices? When Samuel asked him, why didn't you wait for me the 7 days, or why didn't you wipe out all of the Amalekites? He says, basically, I was afraid. The people were scattering. They were leaving me. And then he sins. And with the Amalekites, the people thought we should keep the spoils. And so, I think that's peer pressure is a form of another type of fear. So the people are wanting me to keep these spoils, and so let's keep them. I thought that was wise. And so he reacts a lot of times out of fear that we've seen throughout the book here. And so here's another thing that's set up where it's like Saul was greatly afraid. So even before we get to what's going to happen, we kind of know that's not a good starting point for Israel. The fact that Saul is under this great amount of fear. Go ahead, John. I mean, yeah, there's definitely been some time that has passed here, and it doesn't get super specific like in the scriptures here, but when it says kind of that phrase "in those days," it kind of is setting up a kind of a stage that not necessarily that a whole lot of years has passed or whatever, but it's kind of breaking away from what we've seen where it almost goes from chapter to chapter, and then it just says then whatever, and now it's kind of got this broad statement of in those days. So a certain passage of time could have happened.
It passes what Samuel has told us in the last part of this chapter, that tomorrow he's going to be done. Saul has been in force 40 years now.
Yeah, so he's been king for quite a while. David's been on the scene for a decent amount of time. He's on the run, for like 7 years? Is that right? So, I mean, these things are definitely happening over long stretches of time, compared to us reading a few chapters here. But yeah, so this is nearing the end for Saul, and we're going to get into that in a little bit here from what we just read in this chapter. But Saul's greatly afraid. That sets the stage for what's about to follow. Now, first things first, what does Saul do? What's the very first thing Saul does? Yeah, he's trying to seek after God, right? He goes through multiple avenues too, doesn't he? Whether by dreams, by the Urim, by the prophets, right? Whatever avenue I have to seek out God's, answers, support here, that's what he goes to first. Jordan, do you have a comment? Yeah, so I think a good point with that is because it can be kind of difficult when you read a chapter like this and we're so focusing on it's just this individual story with Saul. You think like, it's Saul's trying to reach out and he's trying to, connect with God. And, does this mean at some point God's just going to cut us off and, not connect back? That's not how Saul's reaching out to God. If you look at Saul's response here, this is not Saul, the man, appealing to God. This is Saul as king seeking strategic advice, right? Hey, the enemy's at our doorstep. He's brought up his army. He's assembled a mass to go against them. But, he's afraid. He's questioning what to do. And so he's going to God simply for, hey, basically, I need advice. I need some sort of, army counselor here to help me through this situation. Because yet again, I'm backed against the wall. What do I need to do here? And so does God respond through any of these avenues? No, he does not. He does not respond. So what's his follow-up? What's Saul's backup plan then? Is he just going to go it alone, or what's his backup plan? Scott? Yeah.
He's chasing David. He's the hunter, and he knows he's in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, so when he takes the initiative, generally that's when we've seen positive examples of so like I think very early on, right, when we talked about Saul first being kind of anointed as king, and there's that situation with the oxen, right? And he kind of chops up the oxen and sends it out to all of Israel, and it's like, hey, if you don't get together and we don't unite here, like this is, may this be, happen to you guys, to your oxen and so forth. And, rallies all the people together, and there's this uniting moment. And certainly, there's other examples early on where we see, Saul has brief moments of positive things that occur as king, but we've seen once again, as Scott mentioned, his reactive nature is very sinful. When he is reacting to things being done to him, where there is any doubt in him, he has reacted very sinfully, almost unanimously when we've seen him, throughout this book. So yet again, God doesn't answer him, which we'll get into why. I'll wait till we kind of read what Samuel says back to him. But God doesn't respond to him. God hasn't been responding to him. God hasn't been someone he sought out information from. So this shouldn't have been a surprise. But, obviously he's desperate. Finds a witch, an Endor, a medium, someone to converse with the dead, who he had previously outlawed and had, kicked out of the land. But now he's desperate, and he goes to seek them out. He disguises himself, gets to this witch, and, I know I'm skipping along here, but I have a tendency to hang over the first chapter too long. So what happens in the interaction with the witch, though? She, is told to pick up Samuel, or whatever, call up Samuel, however you want to phrase it. I don't know how witches term that. But Samuel is the one that Saul wants to talk to. And does he get a chance to talk to him? Yes. Yes, he does. So, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I'm sure somebody had a question in there where it's like, this is evil, this is sorcery, that God didn't have to let this work. Why does this work? What does anybody have any thoughts on that, John? Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, maybe that's more how I should have read it. Like when she is like, "Oh wow," it's kind of that idea of like, you ever seen somebody trying to do the pull the sheet underneath, like with all the silverware on top, and it's just like, you definitely did it so many times in all the silverware and everything. But somebody did that just that first time, and it's just like, wow, it actually worked. Like maybe that's how she's responding here. Like, man, how's this working? But for whatever reason, she sees Samuel coming up, and that is her realization. Okay, this isn't just some straggler. This is Saul, and maybe this was a trick the whole time, but it's not. Saul really wants to talk to Samuel, but what does Samuel say to him then? Like, let's just get to what does Samuel say to him? Yeah, first off, why are you bothering me? Why'd you call? Whatever term you want to say. Why'd you beckon me? What else? What does Saul say? What's his reason? In verse 15. Say that again, Jeff. Yeah, see, he's not going to have any good news, but Saul says in verse 15, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore, I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. Now, my favorite thing from this whole lesson tonight is Samuel's response. Verse 16, what is Samuel's explanation back to him once he says that? Yeah, verse 16, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. All right. We remember, lessons back, right? When Samuel says these condemnations to Saul and condemns him for the sin that he commits and offering the sacrifices, and then also for not wiping out the Amalekites. And Samuel says, hey, we're never going to see each other again. And it kind of is like this weird full circle moment where, Samuel's spirit is brought up here and is speaking to Saul. And all he says to him is exactly what he had already told him, right? Saul's been, and, John, you mentioned earlier, years have passed. He's been king for a long time. And he comes back to this, final conclusion of his story. And it's all just for Samuel to say what he already told him before he died is, you've turned away from God, therefore he's turned away from you. You're confused as to what's going on here. You pretty much said it all in that one phrase. God's turned away and doesn't answer you anymore. Like, what do you think you're going to solve? What do you think is going to get fixed here by you calling on me or you going any other place? And I think that's such a interesting, fascinating phrase because, we should look at it the same way. Like, whatever altering moves, like ulterior plans we might set up if we feel like, if we turn from God, just know those things are going to fail. Ultimately, those things end in failure. And so Samuel doesn't need to sit there and go through all the things that, hey, you could, well, don't worry about doing this or that or this. He just says, hey, you told me God's left you. God's not responding to you because you've abandoned him. There's nothing else to say. And then he even adds on something further. We knew that David was going to be king. We knew Saul was going to have the kingdom stripped from him. But there is one piece of information that Saul did not know that Samuel tells him when he goes to the medium. What does Samuel tell him that he didn't know before? Yeah. So tomorrow you're going to die. So however you've been, it's so fascinating, this interaction, because it's everything kind of climaxing in Saul's life. I know it's easy to look at like a couple chapters later when Saul dies and being like, oh, this is what it was all. This is what it's building to. is Saul's total realization that everything he's been trying to avoid for these however many years it's been from when Samuel told him this and told him, hey, God's left you and he's given your kingdom over to your neighbor. Everything that he's done to avoid going to God, but to avoid God's plans coming to pass has been for nothing. It's been for naught. Like nothing's been accomplished in that regard. He still tells him all the same thing. You're going to have the kingdom taken from you. It's being given to your servant David. And now the additional piece and the last one. You and your sons will be with me tomorrow. Like now it's gone even a further extent. And we talked about weeks back when Saul was angry at Jonathan, right? Because he was saying, David is the threat to your line, and he's going to be a threat as long as you live, right? That's been Saul's motivation, is to protect his line. And Samuel's telling him, hey, your line's ending, right? Your claim to the throne is ending tomorrow. And so I just think it's a very interesting way of how this is wrapped up with Saul's realization. And I know we've talked about how Saul has had these moments of clarity where he said, David, I recognize that God is with you, that God is going to make you king and that things are going to work out well for you. But then we see Saul's actions don't really reflect that he's bought into that and is going to live by that knowledge, right? He's still going to keep doing his own thing. And I was thinking of this. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Gladiator, but there's this scene at the beginning of the movie where the Romans are fighting, I don't know who it is, in Germania or something like that, just kind of a small, insignificant group of people. And one of the commanders, a small group, one of the commanders tells the general, and he's just like, people should know when they're conquered. And I think that's kind of it's like a thing I think about with Saul, and it's like Samuel's trying to reiterate that here, but, the key phrase in the movie that he says back to the commander is like, would you know? Like, would you know when you're conquered? Like, would I? Is kind of the following quote. And that's so true. It's just like Saul's been told, you've lost for years. And we keep seeing him constantly like butting up against this wall like, I'm not going to go down. I'm going to keep doing what you tell me not to do and hope that eventually it'll supersede what God wants to have happen. And it's easy for us to look at Saul and be like, man, this is ridiculous. But anybody else done that in their own life, right? With sin, with, selfishness, with greed, with, whatever it is that we struggle with. And it's not so much that we, just immediately like, oh, that was bad and just fix it. Sometimes it's like, no, like let me keep doing the same thing, and eventually, like, not only will I get over this difficulty, but then everything will actually work out great. If I just keep doing the exact same thing, it'll fix itself, and it'll all just fall into place, right? That's how Saul has been living his life, even though he's had these signs on the road, these road signs like, hey, get off here, exit now, collision ahead, like, and he won't do it. He's going to keep going his own way. And we have to be smart enough to see these types of examples and be like, hey, like, I'm not any different than Saul if I do the same things. Whatever my pitfall is, and whether Saul's is his fear or his greed to remain king and the power he desired, he kept going his own way, contrary to God's desires. If I keep going my own way, I'm going to have the same type of ending. It doesn't mean I'm going to die on Mount Gilboa or anything like that, but I'm going to have the same sad ending one way or the other. And that's the same for any of us. And that's the message we're trying to preach to people is like, hey, like, I know how this ends for you, but more importantly, we're trying to say, hey, this is how it ends with Christ, right? So that's what we're trying to help people is to teach them like, hey, you're wondering what's down the road. We are comforted by the fact that I know what's down the road. But if I go my own way, I don't. Beyond what God's given me the example of, which is basically, pitfalls, disaster, sadness, depression, anger, and then ultimately acceptance of my own destruction, right? So I guess maybe I take that back. We do know what's down the end of that road as well. But I know it's depressing, but life without God, I think if there's anything we can pick up from Saul, even if you are king of a nation, life without God is depressing. Life without God is a sad existence, a miserable, tormenting existence. And so, without getting too much more into this chapter, I know I've already gone a long way on this, but it's just I'm a heavy first chapter kind of guy. But I think the main part from this chapter, beyond like sitting here thinking like, well, God, why did God let the medium raise up Samuel? Like, was that really Samuel? Like, what happened there? Like, was that God working through the medium? And if so, why didn't he just supersede? Like, this chapter is to show you the absolute desperate position that Saul is in. This is the lengths he is going to. And let me read you a couple verses as we kind of wrap up this chapter that kind of are meant to, be evoked once you read this chapter and, having context of the law. Leviticus 19, do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. All right, and then in Deuteronomy 18, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God, for these nations which you are about to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this. This takes me all the way back to the big beware sign, right, when Saul becomes king. And all those warnings that Samuel gives the people. But even before that, the very first warning was in what the people wanted, which was to be like all the other nations. And they wanted to have this king who would fight their battles and be like everyone else. But that's how they saw everyone else. These phrases here in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that's how God saw everyone else. So the people of Israel saw every other nation as, one thing, like, oh, they're hip, they're cool, they got the new high tops or whatever, something dumb like that. God sees the wickedness of the other nations. And now we see how Saul has gone to that lowest point that God has, said, this is the reason you're driving them out. This is the reason I'm removing them from this land. Not only just to give it to you, but they're being dispossessed because of how they have acted. And one of those things was divination, fortune-telling, necromancy, being mediums, speaking to the dead. And this is what the king of Israel has now gone and done. And so kind of just like how we see that kind of imagery in Judges where we see like, man, look how terrible Israel has gone to, they punish Benjamin by becoming like what Benjamin did, right? Well, now we see Saul going to God to protect him from these other nations. Saul becomes like the other nations, right? That's the imagery we're supposed to be seeing here of how Saul has become, just like Samuel told him, like, beware of doing this, of making someone else other than God your king. And here we see him kind of hitting rock bottom for sure. Like in terms of just that full, cycle of, good position all the way now to utter depravity. Go ahead, John. Yeah, no, when you're in such close proximity, right? What's that? Be fruitful and multiply. I don't know what to tell you, but the fact is they're in close proximity, right? Like the Philistines are just on that western border of Israel, and so it's just natural, this fighting over land, this fighting over possessions, resources, things like that. these two people do not like each other, right? As a teacher, you find that out a lot. Like, for whatever reason, and usually the distance in a classroom isn't enough. If you have two kids in a classroom that don't like each other, they will find a way to close the gap and continue to dislike each other in a louder nature for everyone else to hear and find out. So you have to figure out how to keep kind of barriers there. But, Israel, Philistines, they're right next to each other, and certainly they keep having these run-ins. But Saul's gone to the greatest lengths he can, and he gets some information, and he gets the truth, but it's not exactly what he's been looking for. And I think kind of the last few verses where it talks about him being totally weakened, being totally incapable of kind of moving, like fear has possessed him and he has no energy, like just further illustrations of he's at the end. He's got nothing left to give. Spirit, body, anything else, like he doesn't even have the will to keep fighting this fight anymore. And so, I think that is kind of very well shown as we wrap up chapter 28. Does anybody else have any other comments or questions or things like that from chapter 28 before we kind of leave and go to chapter 29? Because 28 and 29 are kind of happening around the same event, but they're two kind of totally separated things. All right. Well, let's leave chapter 28 and read chapter 29 here. Switch the scene over to David. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 29. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lord of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me? I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you shall march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to the battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Okay. So once again, this is all still around the same event, this battle that's about to take place in chapter 31. And so, in fact, this is likely could have happened probably before chapter 28, because in chapter 28, Saul sees all the army amassed up against him. And here it's kind of this army that is on their way to be amassed before Israel. So this is kind of a, opposing views kind of situation here. But when we left off David, he was with the Philistines, and we talked about this at the beginning of class. He's been secretly, doing good for Israel, right? He's been going about and, destroying these other, groups and people and taking their possessions and, wiping them out so they wouldn't be able to tell Achish that, he's not harming Israel. He's instead helping them. But now it gets to this point where I think very reasonably Some people have some concerns with David going up to battle with the Philistines. So who has a problem with David being with the army? Yeah, the lords of the Philistines, right? And we mentioned, this nation, kind of is composed of these 5 large cities, right? And so there's rulers set up over each of them. So maybe this is them, including each of their individual kind of commanders or counselors with them. But they've got some issues with David going up there. Achish kind of briefly makes a stand of like, hey, he's trustworthy, he's been loyal to me, but what is the reasoning that the lords of the Philistines say to Achish of like why he's not coming up? What do they think is going to happen? Beyond just like he's going to return to Israel, but like why do they say he's not trustworthy? Yeah. Yeah, so once he gets out to battle, go ahead, Jordan. You fill in some others.
I was going to add in, they're probably pretty rightly founded in that, because we think how David couldn't have had his own hand to harm Saul. I don't think he could have been in a situation where Saul could have been harmed and not acted to protect him. That's how much he had respect for that anointing of God.
Yeah, so this is kind of it's an interesting. I laughed when I kind of read it because it's like we've talked so much about how David's gotten repaid evil for good, and he's playing the spy. So they have, Jordan mentioned like they have every reason to doubt him because they should, because he's been secretly undermining all of the work that they think he's been doing has actually been in service for Israel. But the funny thing is, assuming David was a good worker, right, and was doing good, it's kind of another situation of which now the Philistines are repaying his good work for them with evil, right? Like, we still don't trust you, go like, and David kind of has that similar response that he did with Saul, and it's just like, have I not served you well? Like, have I not been doing well here? So it's kind of funny that David's still kind of, no matter who he's with, Israel or the Philistines, like kind of the same response here. But yeah, the Philistines had it dead on, right? Like, there's no way we could go into battle with this guy. And Jordan mentioned, specifically with Saul, like he hasn't been able to strike out Saul when he had ample opportunity. Like, how can we trust him to do it on a battlefield? But not even Saul. I don't think David could strike down any of the nation, right? The people that he is going to be anointed king over, right? So I don't know what David's plan was, but I'm guessing it was, I'm going to get there, and then God's going to figure out what I need to do to, undermine the Philistines. Now, does David go back? Does he override what the men say? What does he end up doing? Does he listen to Achish when he says go back to Ziklag? Yeah, he goes back. Now, this is how I believe it worked out. I think this is how God was once again protecting David, delivering David. Because what did Samuel just say to Saul in chapter 28? Not only is Saul going to get killed and his sons, who's getting handed over? Who else? Yeah, the Israelites are going to be handed into the hands of the Philistines, right? And so I kind of was led to believe, based on the context and from chapter 28 and everything like that, God doesn't want David a part of this, right? I'm not going to have you be in the midst of that, mainly because, you're put at risk here, but also I think God was bringing judgment on Israel, right? And David as we have seen, has not been a part of Israel, right? He's been separated out, but there is some judgment that God is putting down on Saul, and this army that is with Saul is going to also bear some of the punishment because they're all going to be handed over to the Philistines. And so, I think David being sent back is, God's plan of preserving David. And so he's not going to be in this bloody battle that is going to result in a lot of Israelites dying, specifically Saul and his his sons. So, excuse me. Anybody else have any thoughts on that particular situation, or anybody else read it differently than I did? That's kind of how I was leading with it, but I know it doesn't expressly say, God was, planned for this to happen so David would avoid the battle, but that's kind of how I took it.
Understand why those commanders didn't want to have David with them. He was with them a few times back through the years. So they have a reason not to trust him.
Yeah, I think it's funny what Saul said a few chapters back. We mentioned how, like, before he went down and hunted down David, he was like, go make sure where this guy is and, like, all the escape places he could go, because he's very cunning, right? And I feel like everybody knows, like, David's very smart. He's got it all. It's almost obnoxious, right? Good looking, super successful, cunning. It's like, you almost got to dislike this guy, right? Like, he's got too much of the whole package here. But David's awesome. Everybody sees how great he is. Even other nations know the songs that the women were singing, that set Saul off on his hatred for David. And here it's a reminder to the Philistines of, like, this guy killed the best that we had. He's wiped out several of our armies. He's caused many heavy blows to occur. Like, he is the crown jewel for Israel, and now we're bringing him into battle with us and trusting that he's going to work for us. I don't know. Seems sketchy. So they were totally reasonable from their vantage point, absolutely. And they made the right decision, because I think if he had gone into battle with them, I trust God would have preserved David, and that would have been bad for the Philistines, right? So David is preserved. He's sent back to Ziklag, and the Philistines go up in battle against Israel. So we mentioned, and as we kind of get to the end of this quarter and this book, right, think of just the journey we've seen with these two main characters, right? And even Samuel's kind of, his presence is felt again here. These are the three characters we've been with the majority of the book, right? We see the desperation of Saul, the wickedness that he goes to preserve what he thinks are his last ounces of hope. We see Samuel, who continues to be the mouthpiece for God, and just like it said several chapters back, every word that Samuel has been given by God has never fallen. It has never failed to come to pass. And so we can trust, which is why Saul was going to Samuel in the first place. You could trust the words of Samuel. That's why Saul was seeking him out. And sure enough, he got this information. So, he knows what's coming to pass, even more so now than he's already been reminded several chapters now. But we see the desperation of Saul. We see Samuel as he's been this great leader. We mentioned a few lessons back of, like, the significance of him dying and how much of a vacuum there became for leadership, especially with David being kind of excommunicated by Saul. There's this huge leadership vacuum because Saul is not the leader he needs to be. And so we see Samuel's great influence that he had throughout his life, and the difficulties that occurred with Saul as king without Samuel there as a guide or a counselor to him. But also in this section, yet again, we see David being preserved by God, right? We see God's plan to continue to deliver David, and that just like Samuel said to Saul, David is going to become king. We've seen it multiple times, and it's just been this real long, drawn out, crazy adventure, and he's still not king yet, but God's not forgotten, right? God's not forgotten the promise that he made to Saul, to David especially. You are going to become king, and he's going to go through a great amount of difficulty, but God is still there with him. God is still preserving him. God is still protecting him. And I think that's a pretty awesome message for us to see that, even when things are difficult for us, like, trust that God is still there. God is still preserving us. And we trust that God's promises are still intact that he's made to us. And we can take confidence in that. So we'll finish out chapter 30, chapter 31 on Sunday. and that'll be the end of the quarter. So, all right, guys. Be sure to pick up the questions for 3:12 on your way out, and I'll see you all on Sunday. Thanks.